first off, thank you to Thomas for letting me shift this back a day. Sorry I didn't do it yesterday. As I'll explain later, I basically broke my demo quite dramatically. I have spent nearly every minute since I got here in my room trying to fix it without much luck. It's not the end of the world, but it means I've had to re-engineer some slides. I've had to try and illustrate what I wanted to do with the visualization tool. So basically, one of the things that we put together was a very nice real-time visualization, basically, of a network. We're tapping lots of nodes in the network and able to display it in real time. And I wanted to use that because it's really good for demonstrating, especially de-anonymization attacks. It's a very useful way of doing that. It gets the message across in ways which are, words don't really do justice. So anyway, that's the story there. So my apologies for the for the postponement of the talk, but here we are. So hello, SyScan'. Again, thank you for taking the time to come, and I hope this is educational. This is going to be a lot broader than some of the other talks you've had. So I heard bits and bobs of the other talks. It's really, really good, high-quality material, very technical, very in-depth. This is going to be a bit more airy-fairy, and that's just how it is, I'm afraid. I can get very technical if you want me to, so if there's anything you want to call me up on, anything you don't agree with, by all means, have a go. Right. So, quick introduction. An agenda. So, who am I? My name's Greg Jones. I am, who am I? Let's see. So, I work for a company called Digital Assurance. I've been in security for pretty much 20 years now. I've been pen testing for pretty much 20 years as well. IT a bit longer than that. I started off as a programmer back in 1990 at IBM, MVS, COBOL, PL1, all useful stuff. So, I've done lots of stuff over the last 20, 25 years. I guess I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. So I know a lot about a little, I suppose. That's probably a fair way of saying it. So, and that's probably one of the reasons I don't do this very often, because this is the sort of environment really for a subject matter expert. It's not to say I don't know about this, I do. But typically my sort of experience, my knowledge is broad, not necessarily that deep always, but that's me basically. So I've got reasonably good grasp of security, both technical, procedural, policy, personnel, you name it. Most of my work is probably HMG, so mostly sort of UK government type space. Not really by design, that's just how it's ended up. But that's my sort of background. So these are the things we're going to go through. I think hopefully that's just fairly clear, really. So without further ado, darknet. Okay, it's a phrase I don't actually like very much. I think it sounds a little bit underhand, a little bit nefarious. But then again, lots of nefarious things go on the darknet, as they do on the internet. I don't really like the phrase, but it seems to me to be the phrase which is most widely used these days, at least. Actually came around a long time ago, this phrase. First time I ever saw it, or it was ever seen, was in a Microsoft paper on DRM, believe it or not, when they're talking about friend-to-friend networks and the ability of friend-to-friend networks to undermine copyright protection, DRM mechanisms. Obviously, it's got quite a different meaning now, but that's where it came from. I think of it really as a network within a network. So think VPNs. If you know about VPNs, then really that's kind of what this is. It's like a meshed darknet, whether you're talking Tor, I2P, or some of the others, they're basically meshed VPNs. So networks within networks. The underlying network, in this case the internet, is purely used as a transport to get from node A to node B, whereas traffic in the darknet between node A and node B is not visible to the underlying network. And this is exactly the same principle as really anything. PVCs, MPLS, all these things, the same idea really. So couple of diagrams maybe to explain that, but basically that's really what darknets are. They are networks layered on top of other networks, and I wouldn't say invisible to the underlying network, but somewhat obfuscated, shall we say. So typically, comms are all encrypted, so basically it's like a crypto mesh. So you've got keys deployed on each node. In most cases, it's public keys, so you're using asymmetric crypto for authentication, and then to determine symmetric keys, I think nearly in all cases, symmetric keys for actual traffic protection. But public keys generally for authentication. Fairly standard sort of mechanism. So mostly decentralized. So if you take a look at something like I2P, which I'll talk about briefly in a bit, I2P is heavily decentralized. In fact, very decentralized. Look at Tor, it kind of feels decentralized, but it's not really, in the sense that you've got the directory authorities, and I think there are 9 of those at last time I checked, which wasn't that long ago. I think there were 9. Maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less, but those that are run by individuals. So without those, the network can function, but not for very long, and not very well. I can see why they've done that. We'll talk about that in a bit. And it's useful because by having that slight centralization, they've managed to reduce their exposure, if you like, to some classic attacks that you see in peer-to-peer decentralized networks. They've got the ability to get a bit of a handle on that. So I think actually the mechanism they've taken is reasonable for what they're doing. But anyway, different story. So with darknets, we've got some design objectives, if you like, desirable characteristics, things that they should do, things that we might like them to do. And this is really, this is kind of off the top of my head, these things here. So I'd love to know if you've got any other suggestions. Let's just go through them. So things that you really must have in any sort of darknet technology, whatever that might be. So obviously, client nodes, so clients, users, need to be able to connect to publishing nodes. So whether that's a web browser talking to a web server, or an FTP client talking to an FTP server, whatever it is. And in some cases, obviously, server-to-server communications. But fairly obvious, but still important characteristic. Because of course, some clients are, well, not all clients are created equal. They're all placed in different parts of the network. Some people are behind NAT, some people are behind restrictive firewalls. So when you start to take those sort of constraints into account, suddenly it becomes not necessarily clear-cut to provide communications. You have to find ways around some of these. And NAT is probably the main one. NAT is a problem for some transport. So if you look at I2P, it will work quite happily behind NAT, but being UDP-based, it's not as NAT-friendly as something like Tor, for instance. It can work, it works fine, but it's not ideal. So another must-have, ensure that the underlying IP address, if it has one, which it probably will, cannot be readily determined. And then that's really the crux of a lot of this. Not necessarily for the purposes of maintaining individual anonymity, or privacy of location. So as an example, if I wanted to take down a system that was on the internet, there's lots of routes available to me. But the most basic route, regardless of any technical measures you have in place, I could physically go to your data center and I could set fire to it. I could set off the fire alarm for it to be slightly less dangerous, but effectively, if you can physically identify the location of a system, whether that's a person, a server, a client, a SAN, whatever it is, you've got a mechanism for attacking that. And actually, that's why darknets are interesting to me, because they don't entirely take away the exposure to physical attack, but they certainly can make it harder. That's what I find very interesting about them. Ensure all node-to-node comms are both authenticated and encrypted. And obviously, these are different things, which is why I said earlier, you tend to have the 2 types of key. Public for authentication and asymmetric, typically AES for traffic protection. So of course, with darknets being mesh networks, mostly anyone can join that network, anyone can participate, anyone can throw up a node, be that in Tor, a relay, or a router in I2P. Because anyone can do that, you certainly don't want your traffic being exposed. So you've got to assume that there will always be bad nodes. There will always be evil nodes. Depending on the topology of the network, it can be a problem. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But in any case, there's absolutely no way you're going to be passing clear traffic around inside a darknet. Now, I'll jump in here quickly. I don't care that Tor, what Tor is designed for. I'm not going to talk about providing access to ClearNet services. I'm not interested in that. I know that's Tor's original objective. Only reason I'm talking about Tor today is because it also supports darknet operation. So it's quite a clear distinction there. So I'm not interested in people sniffing exit node traffic particularly. Oh, it is kind of interesting, but it's not that interesting. It's old hat, it's been done a lot. But when I talk about Tor, I'm not talking about its ability to mask the client's IP address from the server, because fundamentally that's what it was designed for. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the onion land experience that was added, I think, around about 2007, 2008. So another must-have, decentralized architecture. Ideally, no trusted systems or people. Now, as I've already mentioned with Tor, that's not the case, really. Now, they're slightly hands-off in a sense, and they say the network can, in theory, operate without the directory authorities, but it goes to hell quite quickly without them. Things that are nice to have. This thing I've called here, latency. If you're familiar with this area of study, you'll know exactly what I mean here, but latency being obviously how long it takes a message to get from A to B, or communications to get from party A to party B. Tor and probably I2P, I suppose, are both classified as low latency systems. That means you can get a packet from A to B by whatever route reasonably quickly. And that's typically the experience that most of us want for things like web browsing. You want low latency. Now, for things like mail, for instance, SMTP-based mail, it's not quite as big a deal, is it? You're not really worried about it being there in 2 or 3 seconds. You're fine if it takes 3 or 4 minutes. And actually, that delay, that increased latency actually provides you with considerably more robust defenses against traffic analysis. Obviously, it's slower, but latency is a key characteristic of any anonymity system. The lower the latency, typically, the lower the level of anonymity. That's life. You can't do anything about that. So if you look at some of the, still in use actually today really, some of the remailers out there, obviously been going for a good 20 years or so, a lot of the remailers, they will typically take half an hour, 2 days to deliver a message, depending on the configuration. And actually, that's part of their anonymity model, is that delay. So if an adversary is looking at many points of the network, they can see communications going through this point, see it more or less at the same time or very shortly afterwards, see more or less the same type of traffic coming out the other end. Obviously, doesn't mean it's definitely that peer talking to this peer, but there's a reasonable chance it is. And if you can make enough observations over a period of time, you can nail that down quite well, surprisingly well, actually. Asymmetric traffic patterns, paths rather. What do I mean by that? So I mean traffic not necessarily coming back the same way it went out. Now, I2P is a good example of that. You can send, it's quite a different sort of topology to Tor, but you can send traffic out. It'll take a certain path. The return traffic almost certainly won't take the same path. It could in theory, but it probably won't. Asymmetric traffic paths, again, can offer increased resistance to traffic analysis. It's a desirable characteristic, I would say, at least the ability to have it. Underlying network independence. It's very nice if you don't have to necessarily rely on the internet. Hopefully, you know, in the next few years, as things start to develop, perhaps we'll start to see darknet techs work over other networks, not necessarily the internet, perhaps meshed wireless networks, which may or may not be running IP. But the point is, it's nice to have something which can be taken off the internet and put somewhere else, or exist in multiple places at the same time. Portability, so the ability, I suppose, to move publishing, to move a service which is exposed around quickly. Maybe if you take Tor, for instance, I could publish, same onion key, 2 or 3 places. I could actually have that physically hosted anywhere, 3 different places in the world, but you would never know that. So the idea of having an endpoint, what's the word I'm looking for? A floating endpoint, basically, somewhere that's not fixed in space or time, an endpoint which can move throughout the network. What have we got at the moment? Obviously, we've got Tor, say, specifically the darknet mode of operation, so the .onion's I2P. Actually, just out of interest, I'm not even going to ask you who knows about Tor, because I'm sure you all do. Any of you use I2P much? No? Yeah? Maybe? Okay. So I2P's been around for quite a long time, actually. I have had great difficulty getting to grips with it, to be honest. I've been trying it for the last few years. I've tried all manner of things with it. I can't quite bring myself to embrace it yet. That said, it's got some really interesting characteristics. It's quite different from Tor. It does the asymmetric traffic routing we were talking about. It's packet switched rather than circuit switched. And the packets in any individual communication can all take multiple paths as well. So actually, it's quite an interesting system. That comes with its own side effects and negative points, but nonetheless, it's a very interesting system. Latency is low generally, but can be a bit higher sometimes. Freenet. Has anyone here used Freenet at all? No? Heard of it? Been around a long time as well. I won't talk too much about it. I don't know how many people are using it at the moment. I don't think that many, in comparison certainly to the other 2. So a lot of what we're going to talk about, sadly, is Tor hidden services, same as everyone else, I'm afraid, but that's what people are using. That's by far the most prevalent technology out there at the moment. As I said, I'm sorry, I broke my demo. I had a very nice D3-based non-directed cyclical graph, basically. So what that was a very nice circle with a couple of hundred Tor nodes all the way around the outside. And what we could do in real time is basically display circuits as they're being established. We can see when a device comes up on a network, we can see guard nodes being selected. We can see, in the case of hidden services, introduction points, rendezvous points, all being allocated in real time. And I would love to be able to show you that. I spent best part of 35 hours since I got here trying to get it working. But we made the very silly mistake on Tuesday of taking it from an Ajax-based front end to Node.js. I know nothing about front-end stuff. I know even less about Node.js. All I know is I could not fix it. If I can get this other, I've got a sort of demo of what it was looking like working here. If we've got time at the end, I might show you it, because I think it looks really cool. And it's very, very good for describing de-anonymization attacks, traffic analysis, and showing some of the useful things you can do, like traffic padding, basic controls like that, which make analysis much harder. It's very good for demonstrating that. It's also very good for showing how the Tor process works in terms of the steps. When you bring a hidden service online, what does it do? When you bring a client online, what does it do? Very useful for showing that. Moot point, because it doesn't work. It will work by Monday. I'll have it working. So I'd like to show you that next week. It's going to go on the website. I'll talk about the website in a bit. So it will be accessible. You'll be able to see what I mean. I think it's a really nice way of visualizing these networks. So anyway, Tor hidden services. What are they? TCP endpoints, basically. So that's all it is. It's just a port, a TCP port, which is exposed and then redirects traffic to a fixed endpoint. That's what it is. Not magic. Doesn't do UDP, doesn't do GRE, anything else. It just does TCP. So that's all it is. So when I create a hidden service, what I'm actually doing is creating a place that you can find my port, where I choose to put that port, maybe it's going to be on the local host, maybe it's going to go off somewhere else, maybe it'll go back onto Tor, maybe it'll go out for I2P, who knows? The point is, that's all I'm doing. A hidden service is basically an endpoint that you can attach one or more ports to. So communications, I've got a quick diagram of this in a moment, but tend to go through 6 hops. So, shall I skip forward? No. So basically, in Tor, typically you will generate 3, sometimes 4 hop circuits rather. So a client will go in for a guard node, then to a middle node, then to an exit node, and the hidden service roughly does the same sort of thing. So it'll have an introduction point, but first it'll go through guards, it'll advertise some introduction points. As I say, I'll explain this in a minute. But effectively what you're doing is basically meeting in the middle. So client comes out, the rendezvous point, and the client chooses the rendezvous point actually. Server agrees to meet him there, and the communications are established, end-to-end encrypted. It's fundamentally what they are. So quite hard, generally, for the client to see where the server is and vice versa. There's a bunch of onion addresses there. What have we got? DuckDuckGo, SR2, as it was, not anymore. Facebook launched 4 months ago. So weirdly, I was having a chat about similar topic a couple of months ago, and I was sort of querying why Facebook, given that they have a policy where you have to register with your real identity, why they bothered having an onion address. I didn't really get a straight answer, but actually the chaps in the audience, Alec Muffet, really good guy, seemed to be one of the sort of driving forces behind that and actually explained why they were doing it, but I still don't quite get it. And of course, our website, you can always get to that through the darknet, so if ever you need to order pen testing through the darknet, that's where to go. So any Tor node can publish a hidden service descriptor. There's no concept of clients or servers. You have relays, but there's no concept of clients or servers. Anyone can publish a hidden service descriptor, and you can be behind NAT. Doesn't matter. It's very good for punching through NAT, in fact. So anyone who's running a Tor instance can expose one or more onions, irrespective of the underlying IP topology, and that makes it very interesting. So things like using stun servers and all of this sort of stuff for getting outside of NATed networks, actually you don't need to running something like this. So the main properties is non-trivial to determine where it's hosted, as I said earlier. That's the main interesting property anyway. Maybe other people would find other properties interesting, but that's what I like. Just a quick overview of onion routing, just to show you. So we've got client, us, hop 1, hop 2, hop 3. These are relays, okay? So these will be run by whoever. Could be anyone. I don't really care who runs them too much, although I might care who runs the first one. Other than that, I'm not too worried about who runs the rest. So what have we got? At the bottom level, all traffic, all OR traffic, so all onion routing traffic between all relays and clients is wrapped in TLS. So there should be, and not always, but there should be a single TLS connection between 2 nodes. Now, not all nodes will have connections up at any one time. The connections will come and go depending on usage of the network. But at the bottom level, TLS is used to encrypt everything between hops. Now, inside of that, we have something else. So when I want to talk to a node, say somewhere off over there, first thing I do is connect to a guard node. And that guard node is a Tor, specialized. It's a class of relay. It's been given the guard flag by the directory authorities, those servers I mentioned earlier. So guard nodes are really important for a number of reasons. I'll touch on some of those a bit later. They're quite important because it's quite obvious really, they're the only systems that know your IP address because you're connecting directly to them. So you cannot hide your IP address from guard nodes. Not necessarily a problem, but I'd say now most of the serious issues with the actual Tor network generally come about because of vulnerabilities in guards or using guards which are not trusted. So what have we got? We got an encrypted link, TLS, underlying encryption. Then we have effectively a tunnel inside the TLS to the first hop. And we're encrypting it using AES. So keys that are derived from the guard relay. So this is where the onion routing comes in. We sort of telescope out. So once we've established that first hop, we've got an encrypted channel inside an encrypted channel. We then put another one in. So we extend that out to hop 2. So the client is doing the extension here. So the client will do an extend circuit request and push that out to hop 2. Again, another set of another key to use to encrypt the traffic. So if you can see there, if this guy, hop 1, if he decides to have a look at my traffic, all he's actually going to see is the traffic encrypted to hop 2. Can't do anything with it. And similarly, hop 2 can't actually see, doesn't even get to see the original wrapper, because by the time it gets to hop 2, the first layer has been unwrapped. And to continue that sort of telescopic extension of the circuit outwards, you guessed it, we do the same thing again, all the way to hop 3. So actually, we've got 3 separate sets of AES keys in play there, and we've also got underlying TLS encryption. And that is aside from any application layer encryption. So let's say you're hitting an SSL-based web service, and there's only a few actually who have valid certificates in Onion Land, and I think that would be blockchain and Facebook as far as I'm aware. But anyway, let's say you were using SSL, then actually you've got yet another layer inside there. So that's the base level of encryption that you would get using Tor, yeah? That makes sense? Straightforward. This is where it all gets a bit wobbly. I had to put this together because of the failed demo. I've put this together quite quickly, so it's not entirely accurate, so I will correct it as we go. Here's a bunch of Tor relays. They've all got different roles. Now, there are about 7, I don't know actually, I haven't checked in the last few weeks, but there's about 7,000 nodes out there. They're generic general purpose relays, but they can have certain roles delegated to them by the not delegated, but assigned to them by the directory authorities. So here, I've got 2 DAs, 2 directory authorities, yeah, top and the bottom. As I said, I think there are 9 in the live network, but I'm not going to draw 7,000 boxes on here. So directory authorities are super relays. They don't carry more traffic necessarily, but they have the ability to vote. They have something called a consensus, which exists in Tor. The consensus is basically a list of every other relay in the network. And the consensus will contain flags on the other relays. So let's say I'm running an exit node. An exit node is something you go out to the internet for. If I'm running an exit node and I start stripping SSL traffic or man in the middling or otherwise being slightly nefarious with users coming through my box, then I could get something like a bad exit flag. So the Tor operators or the directory authorities can say, okay, this guy's SSL stripping, mark him as a bad exit. That is then pushed into consensus. Every single client will download the consensus on a periodic basis. Typically, it's about once a day, roughly. I think it might be slightly longer than that. About once a day. And when that list comes down, it basically has all the relays, all of their public keys, and all of the flags. And those flags are assigned by the directory authorities, as I say, which basically automatically vote with some manual intervention here and there. Some quite inexplicable manual intervention, actually, I will say. Well, talk to me afterwards if you want about that. What else we've got? We've got guard nodes. So guard nodes are the nodes you go into the network through, yeah? There used to be a lot more. Now there's only about 2,000, I think. They changed the way guard node flags were assigned back in August. So now it's only the top 25% of the network speed-wise. I think they did that to stop people throwing up lots of bad guard nodes, because people were throwing up dodgy guards. There was a lot of traffic analysis stuff, which we'll go on to later on. The changes they made it harder to get a guard node up, but of course having your own guard node is actually one of the most important things in Tor to maintain anonymity. Not maybe one of the most, but certainly it's important. A whole bunch of other boxes, rendezvous points, hidden service directories. Anything else? Okay, that'll do for now. So basically, these TLS connections, yeah, that we showed you earlier, not necessarily every node to every node, but generally most nodes. If a node's not been up very long, it's not going to have too many connections. The longer it stays up, the more nodes it tends to, more links rather, it tends to establish. So let's say I chuck up a hidden service. So I'm that thing I mentioned earlier, an endpoint. I'm exposing an endpoint, a port open, sticking out on the network. That's me up there running a Tor client, let's say. I started off well with this, and then ran out of time. The first thing the hidden service does, the first time you power it up, basically Tor starts up, and it goes, okay, let me go and get a new consensus. So it'll connect off to the directory authorities and download a consensus. Sorry, directory authorities, but download a consensus. Those addresses are hard-coded into Tor. So it will do that, it'll get a new consensus. Once it's got a fresh consensus, it can then start making decisions about who it is or isn't going to go and connect to. Let's see where we got to. Okay, so once we've got that, we establish our initial connections into the network, which go in through guard nodes. So we select typically around 4 guard nodes. That's soon to probably drop. Usually it's 3 or 4 guard nodes. Certainly 2.5 version of Tor looks for 4 guard nodes. So the first thing we'll do is establish connections to the guard nodes. So remember, you got your underlying TLS wrapper, and then we're now establishing, this is our first telescope, yeah? This is our first connection out using those AES keys. Then we have the second hop, which go to middle nodes, and we have the third hop, which actually go to exit nodes. Even if you're using hidden services, they go to exit nodes. If you run a network and don't have any exit nodes, you can't run hidden services. I don't quite get that, but that's currently how it works. So even in darknet operation, you still need to have exit nodes on the network. And that's where I run out of time to animate the slides, so let me explain the rest of it to you. So once you've got connections established from the hidden service side, the first thing we do then is take our onion key, which is basically it's that .onion address I showed you earlier. It's derived from a 1024-bit RSA key. So that's what underwrites that is. You don't apply to anyone for them, you just generate them. That is basically published to a hidden service directory. So we publish the key and say, okay, here's a key. We identify something called introduction points previously, just prior to issuing the key, which is basically we choose typically 4 or 5, I think it's 5 random nodes, and we say you are our introduction points. So we maintain a persistent connection to those, and when people want to talk to us, they can use those, or they can use that to signal us and tell us where to go next. So we establish connections to, I think, 5 introduction points if they're available. It'll work happily on 2 or 3. They're chosen randomly. At that point, we then upload data to, say, the hidden service directory, and that includes our key or hidden service descriptor, and it also includes the list of those introduction points. And that's where the story ends at that point. The client does a very similar thing. He will get the new consensus from the directory guards. Directory authorities. He'll come in through a guard node, choose some guard nodes, come in through them, get all the way to the exits. So exactly the same process. But then, if he wants to talk to me, he will contact the hidden service directory, which is, there's a couple of thousand of those at any one time. And actually, what the hidden service directory is, think of it like DNS, yeah? So it's a distributed hash table that operates between those relays that have been assigned the HS-dir flag. So I'll make a request, and I'll say to the hidden service directory, here's the descriptor I'm looking for, tell me if you know about it. If I've hit the right HS-dir, it will respond to me and say, okay, yes, I know this guy, these are the introduction points. At which point I choose something called the rendezvous point, which is RVP, if I put it on there, yeah, up the top. Now, the rendezvous point I choose, so then I signal down to via the introduction points, I signal the hidden service and say, come and meet me at the rendezvous point. He connects to the rendezvous point, I connect there, the stream is joined, it's end-to-end encrypted, and when we can establish communications. So at no point have I revealed my identity and vice versa. Anyways, what we're doing, we spent 2 years looking at this stuff. Mostly non-technical, actually. So I've extracted as much technical stuff as well, a reasonable amount of technical stuff from it, but actually a lot of the stuff we're doing wasn't that technical. Main interest really was observing attack and defense, because I've seen an awful lot of attacks, certainly, in the last couple of years, a shocking amount, really. I've been using the internet since it was available. And, you know, there's an awful lot of attacks, malware, DOS on the ClearNet, but actually, pound for pound, you know, it's a war zone, basically. 90% of our effort directed at the hidden services, because I say that's the part we find most interesting. We're not really interested in the other characteristics of Tor particularly, or any of the other networks out there. Run a bunch of Tor relays, have done for a couple of years, some exit nodes, some hidden service directories, which are interesting. Hidden service directories are interesting. Small number of hidden service sites. If you want to know what they are, you can ask me afterwards. I might tell you. And actually, just maintaining a presence, a personal presence, a human presence. Most of the information that we know about, most of the interesting things, both technical and non-technical that we've heard, are actually come from forums, from talking to people. Very interesting. Darknet testbed, I'll talk about that in a minute. So we built what I think is probably one of the largest ones. We use that a lot. Lots of different interesting things we do on there, and that's where some of the information I'm going to tell you has come from, really, is from operating in there. You know, the interesting thing here, especially with some of the individuals we end up talking to, is remaining on the right side of the law is quite important, and it's not always clear-cut here, especially where you've got international issues of international jurisdiction, things that are illegal in this country aren't illegal in that country, and vice versa. It gets very complicated. We actually took some legal advice about a year ago on some of the areas we were working on, because it felt a little bit close to the mark. And you know, the last thing you want to do is end up getting into the bad books of a foreign law enforcement establishment. Oh, sorry, darknet markets. That's, yeah, darknet markets. You know, we get a lot of information, lots of things, lots of people, most of the information, we just burn it. Not because it's not interesting, but because we don't want to know it. And actually, we don't need to know it. So we distill what's interesting, and the rest of it we throw away. We don't archive it, we don't retain it, we just get rid of it. Not necessary. State of the Dark Nation. So there's about 35,000 onions at this point in time, roughly. Tor project started gathering some stats literally a couple of months ago now. So there's a bunch of relays they've deployed which gather, or not necessarily they, but people have deployed, which have got hidden service statistic logging turned on. So extrapolating out, because obviously not all relays contribute to that, seems to be about 30,000, which I think is probably about right, feels about right. Most of them that expose a identifiable service is generally a web server. There's lots of them which seem to expose nothing. I'm sure that's not really the case, but those which expose common services, shall we say, and I mean common, I mean things like web, maybe SSH, maybe VoIP at a push, a few other things. Obviously, we don't port scan everything on the darknet. Not possible to count users, but extrapolating HSDR stats, and I can't remember the chap's name, a professor from Portsmouth. I spoke to him a couple of months ago, saw the way he'd been doing it, and it's kind of the same way we'd been doing it, and a few other guys, which is basically looking at hidden service descriptor requests coming in. Very easy to do, actually. And from there, you can make some rough guesses to how many people. Is that minutes? Wow. Thanks. So lots of darknet markets come and go. They're quite interesting for a number of reasons. Lots of torrent trackers out there. Basically lots of stuff. There's loads of stuff out there. Same sort of stuff you would see on the internet. So lots of services, mail services, lots of wikis, the markets, as I mentioned, loads of forums, Bitcoin mixers, instant messaging, things like Tor chat. Lots and lots of interesting services. Same sort of stuff you see on the internet, really. What are the darknet markets? Well, I'm going to talk about them quickly, not too much. I don't think it's really that relevant for the audience, to be honest. What are they? Yeah, it's basically just like eBay, but without the terms and conditions. Mostly things like drugs, hacking services, some markets, things like weapons, mostly stuff that you probably would be considered illicit in most territories. Doing about 20 million a month, roughly, US dollars, give or take. It does vary significantly, so if you look at the last week, I would say it's probably dipped considerably. That's the reason being for that is one of the larger markets, probably one of the leading markets, basically disappeared off the face of the earth about a week ago. Some of the big markets that have existed, obviously Silk Road, Atlantis, Sheep, SR2, Silk Road 2, Tool Market, however briefly, Evolution. Quite a few of them, they're big, they're interesting, and the reason they're interesting is because they're massive, massive targets. Typically they're holding couple of million dollars at any one time in bitcoins and hot wallets, so they are big targets. It's a very competitive market out there as well, or a lot of competition between the markets. I've seen some quite fascinating attacks in the last couple of years, many times initiated by market owners. So I'm going to have to scoot through this quite quickly, to be honest. So as I said, they're massive targets, lots of hot wallets, very badly written code. So I've just seen some shocking application type vulnerabilities, sort of things you would have seen in web apps in the 90s, double spending bugs and negative balance bugs, all sorts of ridiculous, ridiculous things, which you would very rarely see on anything in production on the ClearNet. The reason being, I guess, is because you can't go get off-the-shelf software for this stuff, so generally it's all bespoke, and I don't think there's that many good coders out there who exist in these spheres, I guess. I guess that's a problem. Lots of people hack them because they can't do anything about it. Well, they certainly can't, you can't report people. One, you don't know who they are, and two, even if you did know who they were, and even if they did hack you, you're not exactly going to have the ability to go to law enforcement about that. So people hack on there because they think they've got impunity, basically. Maybe 120 to 140-ish million pounds. I mean, it depends on the exchange rate you choose, which fluctuates wildly, but well over 100 million British pounds disappeared in the last 24 months. Variety of things, hacks, scams, seizures, lots. Biggest thing, I think, for those guys, other than having all their Bitcoin stolen, is de-anonymization, which is pretty much the end of the game for those guys. So just quickly again, I think I'm going to scoot through this very quickly. We spent a lot of time looking at various statistics and gathering bits of information. There's about 4,000 vendors, and okay, a lot of them aren't around at the moment, typically around 2,500 at any one time. We reckon there's about 4,000. Derived from about 7,500 PGP keys, which is obviously widely used for encryption. Evolution, for instance, we did some stats for Forbes a couple of weeks ago. Basically calculated they were doing about, I think they'd posted 50 million, probably closer to 75 million a year all in Bitcoins. Those guys basically cut and run about a week ago, 8 or 9 days ago. So some interesting stuff. If I had more time, and if you want to chat about it later, there's quite a few interesting hacks that have occurred, some of them exploiting everything from O days in Ruby through to some interesting de-anonymization attacks. There's some very interesting bits. If I had more time, I'd tell you, but I don't think it's that relevant for you, so if you want to talk about it later, you can. Attack classes, quickly get onto this. So, classes of attack above and beyond the normal, yeah? Because we're not really interested in the normal stuff. I don't need to talk about it. So, Sybil attacks. So, basically, when you're running, it's a common attack class in any peer-to-peer network. Yeah? It's where you have the ability to throw up lots of malicious nodes which act as a cohort. So they act together to potentially de-anonymize or to wrest control from away from a client. So basically, in the case of Tor, a great example is the Lizard Squad Christmas present. So just after Christmas, they deployed a shed load of relays briefly onto the network. No apparent reason whatsoever. They all gave them the same name, and if you could see that, you would see that they're all called Lizard, NSA, some random identifier. So I think, obviously, within the space of about 24 hours, they were mostly listed, consensus votes were taken down for them. Sybil attacks. Intersection attacks, again, quickly, is where one has the ability to observe multiple communications between 2 points, potentially two parties. And over a period of time, greater number of observations are able to potentially identify participants, or identify that A is talking to B. That's a class of intersection attack anyway. Endpoint attacks, again, this is getting closer to perhaps a normal type of stuff, but the focus here is on de-anonymization. So the example I've given here, I don't know if any of you recognize it, was the JavaScript which went up onto Freedom Hosting, which was actually wasn't actually hosted in Ireland, actually. The guy running it was living in Ireland, but I think it was actually hosted in Hungary or somewhere like that. So what this is was a Firefox, an overflow in Firefox. So basically, you would load up you go to a web page. This would be embedded in the web page. If you had JavaScript enabled, obviously this would execute, which would then load that iframe from that onion address there. That would then download the shell execute an overflow. 1 minute, really? God. Anyway, de-anonymization. Bleeding onions, how quickly can we do this? It was very bad. Cut long story short, I suspect most of the TorNet, if someone knew what they were doing in the space of 3 or 4 days, they probably could have extracted a colossal amount of information from Tor. Critical, undoubtedly critical. It was probably I've only posted one blog post in my entire life, and it was about that. It was a very serious issue. I was genuinely shocked by the amount of information that relays and clients were giving up. If you were using Tor at that point, you know, no expectation of privacy. Traffic tagging, relay early attacks. I don't think we've really got time to go through this, but this happened last year for at least 6 months, probably a bit longer. What this was a tagging attack, basically. So the ability to taint traffic from one point on the network and observe that taint outside of the encrypted wrappers, observe that taint throughout the network. So if you were running multiple relays, a guard, for instance, you would visit a site or visit a service. A relay, an end relay, could basically modulate your traffic. Let's look at it that way. So relay early cells were there's 2 types of cell in Tor, relay and relay early. You could basically inject them into the stream and observe them back towards the client. So you went to a dodgy hidden service site, they could potentially inject relay earlies, and then they could be observed down at the guard node. That was used to de-anonymize quite a lot of people last year on Tor, ostensibly by the guys at Carnegie Mellon, I think, whose talk at Black Hat got canned last July for whatever reason. I think it's a reasonably good chance that was used in anonymous. I've got a quick example of it. I don't think we got time for it, but basically, as I said, any node you're connecting to from a client can send relay early cells back down. You can't send them up, but they can send them back down. That was turned off in July or August. It was a Tor update. They turned logging for it back on as well, so you can't do that anymore. But that was certainly a big problem. It didn't mean they could say you definitely visited a site, but what it did mean is they could say you looked up a hidden service descriptor or you accessed a particular rendezvous point. So you could say with reasonable certainty. So if you look at things like Silk Road, some interesting stuff came out on Silk Road 2 around how they were saying people had been de-anonymized by visiting a certain onion address. Now actually it's very possible. Didn't mean they definitely visited it, but it meant they at least looked it up. Now, from everything I've seen, that's the only explanation for that. So we suspect that was actually used quite heavily last year. Certainly when we got the update in July, I was seeing a hell of a lot of relay early cells coming down to my nodes in July and August time, so it was still ongoing at that point. Let's just skip through that. Okay. Have I got time for 5 minutes or not? Is that good, bad? What's that mean? Yeah. 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. Hardening. Same for services as the endpoints in some extent. So I think you can read that what I'm saying there. So basically the key thing really out of all of that is minimization of the attack surface, it's obvious, and isolation of systems. So for instance, if you want a system to be secure on the darknet, you should ideally have your, whether it's Tor or whether it's I2P, the point where you're connecting to the network should be separated from the endpoint for a number of reasons. So isolation really is key. There's a bunch of stuff you can do with Tor. I haven't got time to. We'll talk about it later on. If you want to chat about it, please do. Minimizing the attack surface. Same for servers. There's lots of clever tricks you can do, some of which we didn't know about until we set up our test bed. Very interesting. Again, talk about it later. I'd like to quickly introduce you to Dark Hive. We deployed it a while ago. It's going live today, so this is the first time I've talked about it. It's basically got, it's a Tor network, testing network with about currently 250 relays in it. We've all got public addresses. You can get on there and hack the hell out of it. You can deploy hidden services. You can test mitigation techniques. You can DOS things. You can do what you like in there. It's isolated. There's no exit, so you can't exit out of the network. If you choose to deploy a relay, you are welcome. If you choose to deploy an exit relay, you are crazy. But if you want to, I would highly suggest, if you want to play with stuff, do it on here. Don't do it on the live network. We're extending this all the time. We're adding I2P in, but I2P is very problematic. So this is really cool. We've made lots of tweaks to the logging and diagnostics, so it's logging a huge amount of information that you wouldn't get out of Tor. We're exposing that all as well, so you can FTP it, you can get it through the web pages. So if you want to experiment, it's a good place to do it. Obviously, you can set your own up, that's fine. But quite a lot of effort went into that, and it's running right now. Some stuff about what it's doing. Basically, if you want to join it, that's what you need in your Tor config. That will get you on. You see the 2 addresses as directory authorities there. That will then get you onto the rest of the network. Got CTF, Tor CTF, .NET CTF. It's ready to go for Tor. I2P again, still under development. Really the name of the game here is de-anonymization. So you start off on the regular Tor network. We've got 2 or 3 interesting but quite easy challenges. So it's all about de-anonymization, and in some cases getting another onion address. But the good stuff, the fun stuff, you need to come onto the test networks. Then you can start deploying dodgy relays, evil guards, Sybil attacks, all sorts of cool stuff you definitely don't want to be doing on a Tor network. April the 1st for the CTF. I don't think we've really got much time. I'm just saying some legitimate uses. Anyway, cut a bit short, and I must admit I tend to waffle. I don't know why I do that. I've always done it. I must get a clock at some point. So if you want to chat afterwards, I'll be happy to. I think it's a really interesting area, and I think it's an incredibly important area. I don't know why. I just get the feeling it is. And when I look at this, it kind of reminds me how the internet did back in about 94, 95. It feels quite similar to me. I don't know why that is, but I get the impression that it's a good thing to know about. And I think it's an interesting area. If you've got time and the ability to do some research and contribute, it would be really good to put some of that energy towards securing the darknets that exist now and the ones that are coming in the future. Sorry, Thomas.
No worries. Okay, thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.